I'm going to tell you 14 things that I think you need to know about river cruising that are watch outs or things you need to know before you go that the cruise lines probably won't tell you and certainly the brochures won't warn you about. Hi, I'm Gary Bembridge, and this is another of my tips for travelers. The goal of this is not to put you off river cruising, but it is a very different way of traveling, and there's a whole bunch of things that I think you need to know to make sure that if you decide to go on a river cruise, you make the most of it. First of all, you can only cruise a relatively limited part of the year. So the season really runs normally from April through to October in Europe. And although there might be some Christmas cruises or New Year's cruises, like Christmas market cruises, the ships are normally put into harbour and basically retired for at least the first 3 months of the year. So there's only a relatively limited period of time that you can go cruising. The second and really important thing to note is that it's very possible and sometimes almost likely that your itineraries will get adjusted because of water levels, so either too high water levels or too low water levels. So you might often find on a cruise that quite close to the time you booked a certain itinerary and it might get changed, or even when you're on the cruise you might find that you end up staying in one place and getting bussed to excursions. Now what's really important on a river cruise is you don't actually travel that far, so you might only be traveling maybe 20 miles or 30 miles. So it is relatively easy for the river cruise lines to then just bus you to the different excursions. In some seasons it can be pretty bad. So for example, in 2018, there was huge big problems, particularly on the Danube, and itineraries were constantly being changed. River cruising ships are basically all the same because they have to be a certain length, a certain width and a certain height to be able to cruise the rivers of Europe. So certainly from the outside you'll find that all river cruising ships look the same. Therefore, if you really want to understand the differences, you need to look inside. So that's why video sites are really important, so you get a chance to look inside the ship. So when you're going to go on a river cruise, you can't really tell by the outside of the ship, you need to really look inside. Also, what's very important to note is river cruise ships have relatively limited facilities. So you normally find there's a very big large lounge area with a bar. You might find at the rear of the ship there's either another lounge or a separate little specialty dining restaurant. There's a main dining room, there's maybe a small fitness center, maybe a small hairdresser, massage area, and a sun deck. So facilities are very limited and choice is very, very limited. You don't have a lot of choice of dining options. So you normally find, actually, particularly for dinner, you have to eat in the main restaurant and there's no room service or no alternative. And that is really important to note because it tends to be a sit-down dinner with multiple courses. So you're going to find in the evening you have to commit to going to dinner, which is going to take several hours. So if you're one of those people that like some evenings just to have a relatively easy evening, like if you're on an ocean cruise you might just go to the buffet restaurant, that's not an option on river cruise boats. You have to go for a full sit-down dinner on most ships. Another thing which is a big surprise to a lot of people on river cruises is that the ships will normally park parallel to each other, sometimes 3 or 4 deep. So you'll often find that you are surrounded on all sides by another ship. So if you're in your cabin, for example, you're basically looking straight into another cabin and can be quite dark. And actually to get onto land, you either have to go through or climb up and over the sun deck. You'll find, particularly on the big busy rivers, you're going to be docking in many places multiple deep. The places and excursions you call on are extremely similar across all river cruise lines. So you'll find they tend to stop at the same places, they're often the same excursions. Now historically the excursions have tended to be much more historical, so you'll go and see lots of cathedrals, walking tours of the town, hear the history. Now more and more cruise lines are trying to diversify a bit more, so you'll find a lot of them will start to have a more active hiking or a bicycle tour, but you'll find wherever you go to they are calling on the same places and doing pretty much the same excursions. So there's no real big difference in excursions. Importantly, most of the cruise lines include at least one excursion on port of call. That's true across most cruise lines. There are 1 or 2 exceptions to that, but generally speaking, cruise lines include an excursion and they will be very similar across cruise lines. Now, one of the things that surprised me a lot when I started going river cruising is just how regimented it is. Now, having been used to ocean cruising where there's much more flexibility, you can get up when you want to, dine when you want to, there's lots of different choices. River cruising is very regimented, so you'll find that there's normally announcements waking up at a certain time, to have breakfast at a certain time because you need to get out on excursions at a certain time, you need to be back because the ship might be moving a little bit along the river, and then going to more excursions, lunches at the same time, very tight, narrow window of time. again with limited choices. And as I mentioned earlier, dinner will be at a certain time and it'll be a multi-course dinner. So it's very regimented. There'll be port briefings, port talks, maybe some local entertainment. It's a very regimented and set experience. Now, of course, you can decide not to go on the excursions and basically build in more flexibility that way. But bearing in mind that most of the times you will have paid for the excursions within your fare. So by not going on them, you're actually paying for something that you're not using. So you'll find a lot of the river cruising lines have developed out of escorted tour companies, or a lot of the people who go on river cruising are people who enjoy escorted tours and that sense of regimented way of traveling. So it is quite a regimented and strict way of experiencing a region. The other thing you need to know is that river cruising is quite an expensive travel option, certainly versus ocean cruising. So even if you take a look at, say, July on the Rhine, even on a budget, more budget end of the side, you're probably paying about $200, $250 per person per day. So that's about £190, about the same in euros. The premium lines, you're probably spending $300, $400 per person per day. So again, about £300 per person per day. So it's a relatively expensive option, certainly when you compare it versus ocean cruising. Now that is partly because the ships are much smaller, so of course they can't amortize the costs across so many people, and also because a lot of things are included within the fare. One thing you'll notice on river cruising is that pretty much all of the cruise lines will say that they're all inclusive. However, you need to understand what that means, because every river cruise line has a different definition of what all inclusive means. So generally speaking, of course, your accommodation's included, your meals are included, maybe things like afternoon tea. But some cruise lines, particularly more premium lines, will include all of your drinks and premium drinks at all times of the day. So for example, Uniworld will do that. Others will include beer, wine and soft drinks at lunch and dinner only. All the river cruise lines will offer free Wi-Fi. Most of them will offer an excursion, at least one excursion in all the places that you call. One exception, for example, is Cross Europe, which is a more value river cruising line where you can actually buy a package of excursions, so your fare doesn't include excursions. Also, what's important is when you're looking at all-inclusive, is it will also differ based on where you're coming from. So for example, using the Cross Europe example, if you're booking Cross Europe from the United States, you'll find that excursions are included. So it depends a lot on where you're traveling from. Gratuities are included in some lines, not in others. So it's very, very important that when you're looking at a river cruise line and it says it's all inclusive, that you do understand what that really means, because it is different pretty much by every single cruise line. Another thing which is very important in river cruising is river cruising, in my mind, is not suitable for people with accessibility issues. So particularly if you're in a wheelchair, river cruising is something that is not likely to work, because first of all, you'll find most of the river cruise ships don't have facilities for people in wheelchairs or with limited mobility. Some of them will have elevators which go between some or all of the floors. But what's very challenging is when you're docking in some of these small towns, particularly along the Danube and the Rhine, there may be very narrow ramps which you have to go up to. There'll be cobble streets, there may be very steep inclines. So it's not really suitable for people with wheelchairs, and there's not that many cruise lines that have accessibility cabins. So if you are in a wheelchair, if you have accessibility issues, check very carefully with the cruise line. Also linked to that is you do need to be relatively active and fit, because most of the excursions are walking tours on cobblestones, upstairs. So although most cruise lines will have a gentle walkers option where they may have a little minibus which moves you around, it is quite an active way of traveling because there's lots of walking involved. River cruising has an image of being for an older traveller, and in practice it still is mostly an older traveller who goes on river cruising, so people in their 50s, 60s and 70s and above. Now river cruise lines are trying to attract more families, so you'll find in the key school holiday periods, you'll find some cruise lines will have more family or multi-generational cruises where they try and build in more activities and features for kids. In my view, river cruising is much more of a baby boomer product and a much more of a baby boomer way of traveling, because those are who most of the people on board are going to be. A lot of the tours and excursions, because they're going to historical places, will have a historical or sightseeing bent to them. The whole structure, the facilities, the way of dining, it is a much more adult experience, and certainly a slightly older adult experience. Solo travelers are one of the traveler groups that are very drawn to river cruising. However, it can be a very expensive way for solo travelers to cruise, because you'll find most cruise lines, certainly in the season, will charge double to occupy a cabin. Now, what increasingly the cruise lines are doing, particularly the shoulder periods are sort of out of season, is they're doing more and more solo deals. So if you're a solo traveler and want to go river cruising. It is a very social way because there's small groups, you get to know people, it's very easy to dine with people, you get to know people, so it's a great way of traveling as a solo traveler, but it is a relatively expensive option. So your main thing to do is to look at the out of season or the beginning of the season and the end of the season, when cruise lines are finding it slightly harder or more challenging to fill cruise lines, and therefore will do more deals. A couple of cruise lines are looking at trying to introduce smaller cabins, more solo cabins, but again, there still tends to be a premium on those. The other thing to bear in mind is when you're cruising down the rivers, and particularly on places like the Danube, is you're going to go through a lot of locks, and you'll find as you cruise, and you might be sleeping in, there's a sort of noise and bumping as you go through the locks. Personally, I love locks. I find them absolutely fascinating, the technology, but it's one of the things that people don't really think of. They just think they're going to be gliding along rivers for miles and miles and miles, but you will find you go through a lot of locks, and it is again slightly odd when you're in your cabin, because suddenly you might find you just got this big concrete wall up against your cabin. The other thing I would say with river cruises is they are slightly noisier than ocean cruising, just in terms of people walking around and talking and noise, because they're much smaller vessels and there's not sort of the ambient noise of the ocean and whatever behind it. So I certainly, whenever I go on a river cruise, I always take earplugs with me. I find that much easier to sleep, but it is a little bit noisier, and I have had some experiences where I can hear the people in the room next door snoring, for example, or televisions or whatever. So if you're a light sleeper, take some earplugs is always a good tip. The intention of these things that I think you need to know and aren't going to be told about river cruising is not to put you off river cruising. It's just so you're better armed, better understand the whole process of river cruising, so that when you go on a river cruise you know what to expect, because there are some surprises and some differences. I'd love it if you watched many more of my Tips for Travelers videos. I have lots about river cruising and lots of tips, and also ship tours and reviews of river cruising lines.